Well, good afternoon, everyone. That was a little weak. Just so we're clear, good afternoon. Okay, that's a little better. So, as you may have seen, we are going to use Slido during my time with you. So I'm giving you permission to get out your smartphone and at least look like you're logging into Slido. You might be checking your Facebook or Instagram or LinkedIn or one of those other apps. But go ahead and get that out, because I do have a few questions that I would love to get your responses to as we go through our time this afternoon. So we'll talk about this in a little bit too, but as Dr. Spear mentioned, my charge was to listen and learn along with you, and then think about how do we bring it all together. And I don't know how many of you are former FFA members. So we've got quite a few hands. So I was FFA as well. How many of you remember the motto of FFA? Learning to do, doing to learn, earning to live, living to serve. So in my world of simplistic view, we've been learning to do in some realms of communicating with consumers and thinking about different technologies and innovations that affect animal agriculture and our entire food system. What I hope we can do over the next few minutes is start to apply some of those learnings, or at least think about or plan for how you all as food system leaders, especially in the animal agriculture space, can go back home and apply those learnings so that you can earn to live and then live to serve. Because I am a big believer that being involved in the food system is one of the most noble callings, because not only are we feeding our friends and our families, but we're providing fiber and fuel, we're protecting natural resources and caring for animals. So that is something that's very important to me, as I know it's very important to you. And so you may be asking, we always get the question, well, who is Roots and Legacies? So our co-founder group, as well as the associates all across the U.S. who work with Roots and Legacies and our various project clients and partners, we cultivate ideas, nourish leaders, and harvest excellence by putting our talents, passions, and agrarian values to work. We engage and develop individuals and organizations. So the first Slido question that I would like you to think about is, think about maybe the first time you began a new workout. Maybe it was after this long winter, you went out to do some yard work, or you went to your gym and started to do something new. And when that Slido question appears, how did that make you feel when you worked out or changed your workout? Did it make you feel great from day one? Was it a little bit painful? You found muscles that you forgot you had? Or did it not have an effect on you? Okay, so we're seeing some results come in there. So what I would propose is that, coming to a conference or a meeting and hearing about topics or from speakers who have various viewpoints and expertise, that's a workout for our mind. It's a workout for our belief system and what we think about. And a lot of times we do feel fairly good from day one because it's releasing some endorphins. We're learning something new. Humans naturally like to learn new things. We like those aha moments in life. However, a lot of times it can be painful. We find muscles that we didn't know we had, or we may have to address biases that we didn't know we had, or a new way of viewing maybe our stakeholders or our consumers. And so that's what I'm going to challenge you to, that during our time, there may be times that I ask you to reflect on what you've heard from a previous speaker or a conversation you've had with table mates, or maybe even something I say that might be just a little bit painful. It might cause us to stretch and expand our minds and our thinking. So I also like interactivity. I think most of you are either at a table with some colleagues or close to a table with some colleagues. Take about 30 seconds or a minute and have a conversation with someone next to you. What was one aha moment that you learned from a previous speaker or one of the presentations, or maybe a hallway conversation? What was an aha moment for you that you've already heard during this NIAA annual conference? Take a couple minutes to have that conversation with a neighbor and be prepared to share. Oh, please. 10 more seconds. Okay. Who would like to share an aha moment either they had or they heard from a table mate or a colleague? Who would like to share first? Stand up, yell it out, or Katie, it looks like we'll have a microphone. I'm going to get one right now. Or she's going to get one right now. Oh, look at her go. Red shoes and all. There we go. Okay, who has an aha moment? You even got a few extra seconds to think about it. Oh, back in the back. 2 back here. Yep, just stand up. Katie will bring a mic.
The aha moment for our group was there is more organic food sold in the United States than what is produced globally.
Okay, an aha moment about sometimes the facts don't always jive with what's being shared by consumers or different groups. So that's kind of an aha moment, okay? Who else? Oh, okay. I'm going to come down here. Who else has an aha moment? I saw a hand. Lucas has one. Are you going that way?
You guys, I need neither one of those.
Okay.
Here you go.
God bless technology. Sometimes it works.
I guess I want to cheat because it was about the last presentation. That's all I can remember. My muscles are a little tired in my head. But the fact that you have gene editing, putting aside the consumer and the fact that you need to go through approval, but it's pretty much, and maybe Emily can talk to in the questions, but it's ready to commercialize. I mean, that we are at that point. That is amazing. What is it going to do for animal agriculture?
Excellent. I'll expand that. I mean, there are so many cool stories that we have to tell in animal agriculture, in the food system, but how do we ensure we have that process in place? And I'll reiterate what Emily said. How are we all prepared to engage in that conversation to support other food system leaders, even if their philosophies may be different than ours about the food system? But at the end of the day, we're all trying to produce a safe, wholesome, affordable food supply. Dr. Rick.
It looks like that I looked at my notes and I said, and I think it was Bobo Jack that said, we are hardwired to understand hazard, but not risk, which sums up very quickly why the world lives in a state of fear.
Excellent point. Yes, so understanding the consumer decision-making process, how we're all wired, is so key if we're going to be food system leaders that are engaging with consumers, especially about technologies and innovations that may be outside of their cognitive ability. How about one more? Katie's got it.
The aha moment for me was the fact I just got handed a microphone. We were a little split. We had a good discussion at our table. Some of us thought the aha moment was seeing just how many companies are looking into alternative proteins. That one slide, that was just, we had to make it so small to see all those other companies. Just how many are on there was eye-opening. But then some of the table thought that the definitive time frame for sunsetting the news tags by the USDA was an aha or moment, maybe, right? That finally we have that. So we had good conversation, but a couple opinions.
Excellent. I like that because there's actually more than one aha moment for a table. And it's interesting. I was sharing with Renee too. I actually had a chance to hear Olivia, the creator of that graphic, at South by Southwest. And what she shared with me is actually that is version 3.0 of that graphic that she has made. And when it started out, it had maybe 10 or 15 organizations on it. And within 18 months, it's become that, and it's already out of date. Katie?
I was going to suggest the disruptive.
Oh, there we go. I can hear it.
The comment that Renee made this morning about disruptive technology, using Starbucks and Lyft as her examples, and how important that is for us to get engaged so that we too can be disruptive technology in animal agriculture. Exactly.
There are some interesting things happening that it depends on how we view it. And actually, for those of you who still have a pen out, I want you to write down some letters for me. If you have a pen and paper in front of you, write down, just in a straight single line, OPPORTUNITHNOWHERE. OPPORUNITHNOWHERE. What do you read when you see those letters in a line? I hear opportunity is now here. Does anybody see anything differently? I heard opportunity is nowhere. Who's right? Depends on your outlook of life. You can either decide that opportunity is now here or opportunity is nowhere. As my uncle would say, some people are weaned on a pickle, so you just have to deal with it. So, you have my biography in your pamphlet, but a lot of times, too, I think it's important, especially as we're engaging with consumers as food system leaders, they want to know who we are as people. So I always like to share who am I? Well, I am one of those foodies that you hear about. If you go out to dinner with me, I'm going to annoy you. I'm going to take pictures of the food so I can post it on Instagram. I'm going to try to mimic it in my own kitchen. I plan vacations around where I can go to learn about food. This is a cheese cave in Italy that we were diving through. It comes naturally to me because I grew up on a farm and ranch in western Kansas. This was my first show steer. He was delicious. He did very well. And then I went on to K-State where I studied animal science and international agriculture. Like some of you in this room, or maybe all of you in this room, I think cows are the coolest thing in the world. You know, the fact that we can just feed them all types of different byproducts and grains and grasses, and they ferment it and turn it into wonderful products for us. So cows are pretty cool. Like a lot of people, my passion for food and agriculture is inherited for me. So that's my mother on the right-hand side. She is a chemistry and physics teacher and professor by formal training, but she is also one of those food people. She retired a few years ago. Her idea of fun is volunteering to cook for 800 underprivileged and homeless individuals weekly in the Kansas City metro area. So she goes and she exemplifies what my grandmother taught us, and probably a lot of your families taught you, that food is a way we show people we care for them, that we love them. That it makes love a verb and not something we simply say. So my food passion and love came from my mother and others. We utilize food to facilitate a lot of conversations. This was actually an article in the Kansas City Star of inviting people in and conversing over a meal. And Dr. Tarto was asking about cricket flour. So earlier last year, I guess actually now, we were actually asked by the Symphony in the Flint Hills to host a Future of Food event in our home. And we were guiding people through cooking with future food ingredients. And one of them was cricket flour. And what was interesting was when we first told our guests, about 20 people, that we were going to cook with cricket flour that afternoon, we were going to make some cookies, the yuck factor was very much alive and well. We primed them with some wine, and they voted and decided, yes, they did want to actually cook with the cricket flour, and then actually enjoyed eating with the cricket flour. I've also done extensive research that wine tastes better by bodies of water. So as you're thinking about how we apply information and knowledge about today's food system and how we engage with consumers, I highly encourage you to go sit by some water as the weather gets nicer, because beverages taste better there. So as we dive into this, like I said, you've heard a lot of great information. And I'd like to share just a few key observations, or at least, I don't know if they're key, but they're observations that I had during our time together. If you hang around me very long, you'll learn that I always love to recommend different books that I think people should either read or reread. How many of you have read Simon Sinek's Start With Why? Any fellow folks? I hear a few cheers, a few hands are up. I would highly encourage you to pick up this book for your next beach read or airplane trip or weekend read, whatever. But Simon Sinek wrote this book a number of years ago of Start With Why. And if I were to boil it down into the Cliff's Notes version, it would be what they call, or he calls, the golden circle. And the concept of the golden circle is that many organizations and individuals within business or trade associations or governmental entities always talk about what they do and how they do it. But very seldom do they ever share with their stakeholders, their constituencies, why they do something. So the example that he would give, if you want to go and look at one of his TED Talks, the example he would give is Apple versus Dell. And if you look at the two companies, they've had drastically different trajectories. Because Apple always leads and has always led with why they do what they do in the technology space. They want to empower their customers to disrupt the world utilizing technology, whether that be with a personal computer, an iPhone, an iPad, an iWatch, an iPod. And if you look at Dell, for example, they also were in those same spaces. They made personal computers, they made wearables, they made mobile telephones, etc. But they always talked about what they were doing and how they were doing it, as opposed to why they were doing it. And so Sinek's thesis of his book is that people don't buy what you do or how you do it, but why you do it. And so as I think about what's been shared by Emily and Jack Bobo and others about engaging with consumers, it's really thinking about why are we in the animal agriculture space? Why are we involved in the food system? Because if they believe our why, which are also our values, what we're doing and how we do it becomes so much less important to them because they believe in our why. We've demonstrated that in many cases, the values we have as food system leaders align or match their values as a consumer, as a parent, as an animal owner or caretaker or whatever nomenclature you would like to use. So again, interactivity. Get out that piece of paper that maybe you were scribbling on a couple minutes ago and take just a couple minutes to think about what is your why? Why are you involved in animal agriculture? If we were to get on the elevator, and even if I asked you the question, what do you do? How would you answer that with your why of why you're involved in animal agriculture? Take just a moment or two to think about that why. So a few people might be making some revisions or continuing, but whether you've completely finished it or it's something you want to come back and review and think about, I think especially as maybe consumers' attitudes about the food system, or at least their questions about the food systems have changed, it's very important that we as food system leaders can begin with our why. Because as Sinek has pointed out in his research in his book, again, organizations and individuals who lead with why are drastically more successful than those who simply focus on what and how. So we've talked a little bit about maybe some of the changing demographics of consumers, the changing attitudes of consumers. And just a couple of observations, too, of maybe why we've gotten to where we've gotten. So it was actually Aristotle who many centuries ago, or centuries ago, said that, or hypothesized that there can be too much of a good thing. And so there were actually some psychologists that wanted to study this. Is this true? Can there actually be too much of a good thing? And so they're out of University of Pennsylvania. Schwartz and Grant were the two psychologists, and they basically said in a book I was reading that everything can be mapped on an inverted U-shaped curve. And so being in the food system, I thought, and I was working at the time a lot with the Center for Food Integrity, and I thought, I wonder if that applies to food and trust. And so I was sitting on the airplane and got my napkin out and drew my x-axis, and I put scarcity of food and abundance of food on the x-axis, and then I put zero trust to complete trust on the y-axis. And I would propose to you, yes, that it actually does work, especially as we look at developed nations, or any nation for that matter. Because if you think about it, if you're in a developing world where there's a scarcity of food, whether it's actual supply of food or maybe the safety or nutritional value of that food, you have very little, if any, trust in your food system. Because even if you have food, you don't know if it's going to make you sick, or is it going to provide the nutrients that you need to function as a human being. And then as your food system develops and you have an access to more safe, abundant, wholesome foods that are affordable, your trust in your food system peaks. But then all of a sudden, when you have so much abundance, so many choices when you go to the grocery store or the restaurant or a friend's house or wherever you're consuming a meal, if there's so many choices, then your trust begins to wane again because there's confusion. There's questions that you can't get answered. And so some of these questions are evolving too because society has simply changed. And in 1988, Time magazine declared that 1968, so 50 years ago, was the year that began to shape a generation because we started to see some societal shifts that were drastically different than pre-1968. So for example, prior to 1968, authority was primarily granted by an office you held or a title that you possessed, again, whether it was in business, in volunteer organizations, in a governmental body, in a nonprofit, in the military. Because you had a title, you automatically were granted respect and authority. So what you said was taken as truth because of that authority. But today, authority is primarily granted by relationship. How do you know this person? What are the mutual connections that you have? How many of you do this? When I go on LinkedIn and somebody sends me an invite to connect, the first thing I look at is how many mutual connections we have. Who do I know that they know? And it starts to connect for me why they may want to connect with me. Is it someone from the food space that's in communications, or are they a technical person? Whatever the case might be. So we look at that relationship we have. It used to be broad social consensus was primarily driven by white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males. But today, if we look across the board around the U.S. especially, there is really no single social consensus group. We have many voices. We have great diversity in backgrounds and thoughts and experiences. This is one I love. Communication used to be very formal. It was very indirect. As I mentioned, I grew up in western Kansas. If the wind was just right, we had 3 TV stations: ABC, CBS, NBC. We happen to be an NBC family, so every night we sat down and listened to Tom Brokaw tell us about the national and world news. And for the next 24 hours, that's what our family and our network of friends and acquaintances discussed, was whatever Tom Brokaw had shared with us. But today, communication is informal. We have masses of communicators, and we all carry these smartphones, and we all have different apps. We're getting news from different sources. So it's greatly changed the way information is shared, both formally and informally. It used to be, especially when it came to science, technology, and innovation, progress is inevitable. If we developed a new vaccine or a new way of raising livestock, of course we were going to use that technology because that's why we did the R&D, that's why we did the commercialization. But today we see more and more consumers saying, well, progress is possible. And I believe Jack mentioned this in his remarks. Just because we can do something doesn't always mean we should. And consumers are very sensitive to that conversation. Just because there's something we can do in animal agriculture doesn't always mean we should do it. And then it used to be that big is respected. The larger a nonprofit was, the larger a governmental institution was, the larger a business was, it had achieved that stature, that size, because it was good at what it was doing. It was good in its business, whether, again, that was for-profit, nonprofit, governmental, military, whatever the case might be. But today, again, we see, well, there's a big is bad bias. Our fear is that the larger an entity gets, they're going to put their motivation ahead of my motivation and societal motivation. And that typically in our world equates to profit. They're concerned that we're going to put profit ahead of food safety, or profit ahead of animal well-being, or profit ahead of environmental stewardship. So demographics are changing. And to illustrate that, I have the next Slido poll. So there's 3 questions I would like for you to answer. The first one is going to pop up there on the screen momentarily. So, what percentage of the U.S. population is non-white, identifies as non-white? (39.3%), 24.7%, or 15%? I'm seeing and hearing clicking. We'll let people just get a few more in there. Okay, for those of you who are straggling so you can hit it when I give you the answer. According to the U.S. Census Bureau last census, 39.3% of U.S. citizens identify as non-white for their race and ethnicity. It's estimated that by 2045 that will achieve over 50% of the U.S. population will identify as non-white for their race or ethnicity. The next Slido question for you. Oh, I may have not. Okay. What percentage of U.S. citizens live in urban areas? Again, this is U.S. Census data, so if you're really good, you can get to Google and Slido. You have an alternative way of taking a test or a quiz. So those of you who said, oh, wait a second. Yeah, 80.7. The answers are in a different order than I remember writing them, so my foils were off. 80.7% of the U.S. population lives in an urban area. 80.7% of the population. We see that continuing to grow. You know, in my home state of Kansas, we have 105 counties. 100 of them peaked in population in about 1930-something. So our peak population was several years ago. Final question. Now, this is according to a recent study by the National Pork Board. What percentage of U.S. households are single-person households? Meaning there is one individual who lives in that household. (28%, 13%, or 7%? So, the back table, they have very creative answers. They're not even mic'd, and I can tell. So, according to the National Pork Board's 2018 study that was released earlier this year, 28% of U.S. households are now single-person households. That compares to in 1960, it was 13%. So we've seen a significant increase in single-person households. Now, you all know each other. I know several of you are colleagues and friends. So you not only can visually see each other in this room, but also you know our industry of the food system. How do our demographics as food system leaders compare to the demographics in the quiz we just took? I hear some chuckling. What are you thinking? Go ahead and stand up and yell it out or yell it out. Okay, I heard somebody say they were direct opposite. How so? What are some specific examples of direct opposite? He doesn't have to, anybody can answer that.
Old, white, and rural.
To be blunt, I heard that. Old, white, and rural. Okay? So, as we think about if our demographics are a little different, than the general U.S. population, not to mention maybe the global population, what opportunities or challenges does that create for us in communications, in reaching our stakeholders? A lot? Okay, that's one answer. Maybe some specific, let's funnel it down now. Okay, so we have to figure out, is the information we're sharing, which is relevant to us, is it relevant to our stakeholders, to consumers? Fantastic. What else? Okay, either you're stretching or I've completely... How about two more? two more challenges or opportunities we have to think about when we think about what our demographics as food system leaders are compared to our stakeholders or our consumers. The first one is the information that's relevant to us relevant to them. So when we're sharing information, are we ensuring that it's relevant to our stakeholders? What else? Oh.
Kind of along those same lines, I guess.
Dr. Cobb.
Oh.
I said kind of along those same lines, I guess. Maybe this is just a repeat in a different way. But most of the consumers out there are 3 or so generations removed from the farm.
Great
and so
point.
they have no attachment to it at all, or even understanding in the least bit.
Mm-hmm.
You know, their animals come from the grocery store,
Mm-hmm.
and so forth and so on.
Fantastic point. That generational removal. I just looked, I have time for this story. So you're right. And there's things that we think about as basic knowledge that we can't assume is basic knowledge anymore. So very quickly, I'll share with you an and, but, therefore story. So I worked for the swine research unit at Kansas State University in undergrad. And at that time, we still housed open sows outdoors in dry lot pens. And so we had a Kansas snowstorm, winter storm coming in. The research unit manager said to myself and my colleague, who was from an urban area pre-vet student in animal science, to go out and throw 3 straw bales, square straw bales, in each of these sow hutches. Well, we had 12 sow pens. My K-State math tells me if he started on the east side and I started on the west side, we should meet at about pen 5 or 6. So I started at pen 12. I'm working my way down. I get to pen 6. My colleague's not there. I get to pen 5. He's not there. I get to pen 4. He's not there. I get to pen 3. He's not there. I get to pen 2. He's not there. I was having very unchristian thoughts about him at that point, trying to figure out why I've just done 11/12ths of our work. So I finish pen 2, cross over into pen 1, bend over to look in the sow hutch. He's still bent over 3 unbroken straw bales. In a very polite way, I asked him what he was doing. And he told me, he stood up, shocked, I should say, and said, "Are you done already?" And again, politely, I said, "Of course I'm done already. Why aren't you?" And he said, "How did you untie those knots so fast? You can't make this up." But as I think about it now, especially in what I do with consumers, you know, in life, when you're prepared or presented with a knot, what do? You untie the knot. And so he looked at these sisal twine bound bales and thought, there's a knot. I should untie that knot. So we had a little education on what a pocket knife or a knee are for, and away we went. So, as I mentioned, my mother's a chemist and physicist by training, so this is one of her heroes that I grew up learning about, and I like what Dr. Einstein shares with us. As we're engaging with consumers who have different life experiences, different backgrounds, who information may be deemed differently relevant to them, we may not be able to solve problems with the same way we've been addressing them in the past. So we may have to think about how we engage differently or in new ways. And KPMG in their 2018 Me, My Life, My Wallet report, as they were looking at consumers, I really loved this quote that I pulled out of their report. All around the globe, survey respondents had the same message. They're crying out for companies in every industry to understand them as people, complex, evolving, and unique. And so as we think about how we communicate, especially about innovation and technology in the food and agriculture space, we have to think about how can we recognize our stakeholders and consumers as those complex, evolving, unique fellow human beings that are desirous of the products that we're raising, processing, growing, distributing, and marketing. So I have a second book for you, How to Win Friends and Influence People, published in the 1930s by Dale Carnegie. And I had a high school history teacher, Mr. Tom Bliss, who always said, you know, history repeats itself time and time again. We as human beings just fail to learn from history down the road. And really, as I think about what we've been sharing in terms of how we meet consumers where they're at, how we communicate with our values to align or demonstrate alignment with their values, how we show interest in the fact that they're unique individuals, well, really, this is what this book was summing up clear back almost 100 years ago. is the way Dale Carnegie proposes that we win friends and influence people is by showing an interest in that individual, calling them by their name, asking what's of interest to them, finding out what their passions are, what drives them. And it's the exact same with consumers today. What are the concerns that they have for themselves and their family? What are the concerns that they have for animals or the environment, or how we're applying innovation and technology? And so one observation that we often shared, or I often share when I'm with the Center for Food Integrity groups, and I would share from our conversations over the last day and a half, is that really as we engage with consumers, if we go in simply with the idea that we're going to persuade them that what we're doing is, capital T, the best way to do something, it's not going to be a very fruitful conversation or engagement. As a teacher, or I know this is a term we utilize quite often, and in places it may fit, but if we go in with the sole purpose of advocating solely on the behalf of our business or our institution or our segment of the food system, again, it's not going to always be the most fruitful and beneficial conversation. And even as a teacher's kid, I would say, if we go in to educate someone or a group of individuals, again, it's not going to go very well. So what I would propose is that we really need to think about how do we become even more relationship driven? How do we form relationships with consumers and organizations so that they see your why? Why are you involved in animal agriculture? Why are you doing what you're doing on a daily basis? And like any good 4-H talk, there's always 3 points to how you can be relationship driven. So, first, how do you seek to understand? As John Maxwell has said in Becoming a Person of Influence, you seek first to understand and then to be understood. So, truly listening to what consumers and stakeholders are saying. What messages are they sharing with you directly, but what messages are also underlying? And even after we think we understand where they're coming from, how do we clarify? How do we dig deeper? How do we explore where they're really coming from? Well, we ask questions. We try to ascertain, again, what experiences have they had that have led them to this philosophy or this belief or this misconception or this fear, whatever the case might be. And then finally, after we've sought to understood, after we've dug a little deeper, that's when we begin to share our story as other human beings, again, leading with our why. So a lot of times we don't need this in food system conversations, but rather we need this. So how do we sit down and have those meaningful conversations? Now, the other thing that I think about, too, is I've worked with different groups, and I've thought about even myself, is obviously there are way more consumers and interested parties in animal agriculture than there are of us to share the story. Well, Everett Rogers in 1962 introduced, as my statistics professor would be happy, something on a bell-shaped curve, because my statistics professor said everything in life can be mapped on a bell-shaped curve. Well, the adoption of technology and innovation can also be mapped on a bell-shaped curve. So we have the innovators, those who take on a new technology early on. My father was an innovator. We had a VCR before anybody else. Now, it had a remote control that could land a Cessna, but we had a VCR before anybody else in western Kansas. He figured out how to use apps on a flip phone before they were even a thing. You know, he was an innovator. Then we have those early adopters, people who wait to see, does that VCR actually work, or did Larry Jones just waste several $100s? Then they thought, okay, Jones bought one and it seems to be working. His house hasn't burned down. We'll go ahead and we'll buy one because we're an early adopter. Then we get the early majority. They come in a little later. Then we have those late majority, and then we have the laggards. These are individuals that still today are listening to 8 tracks because they don't trust an iPod yet. We're not trying to communicate or engage with every consumer on this bell-shaped chart. We're trying to communicate with the early adopters and the early majority. Those, and we actually did this work with CFI. We looked at consumer types based on their philosophies about food and food policies or the food system in general. And we identified that there's 5 different consumer types. And they follow that bell-shaped curve fairly well. But the other thing, and this is what's really cool about technology, because we know the number one place we all go for information, including food system information, are our smartphones. And we can aggregate that data, and we can figure out not only what people are looking for, but we can also start to tease out why they're looking for that information, but also who they're sharing it with, or how they're spreading messages. And so that's why we want to look for those early adopter consumers or those early majority consumers. So if you were to download a CFI report, what you would see from 2016 is that one group of early adopters are peak performer consumers. Now what's interesting too is they're only 17% of the US population, but their share of voice is 25%. So they adopt different attitudes and philosophies about the food system fairly early on, but their share of voice is significant, especially compared to their actual share of the population. So who are peak performers? Well, they're individuals who, food is about self-improvement. A peak performer wants to be at their highest performance, whether it's as a person in their family, in the boardroom, on the basketball court, as a volunteer in the community, whatever. So food is it's a critical ingredient for not only enhancing their performance, but also looking good. They're very concerned about personal appearance. They're moderately educated about food and food politics. It's an obsession with them because they feel like if they don't abide by their own food philosophy, it shows weakness. And a peak performer does not want to show weakness. But what's interesting about them, especially if we were to look at that bell-shaped curve, next to them are the early majority, which are providers. Providers are 1/3 of the US population. But they don't have time, because they're providers, they don't have time to research the latest and greatest diet or the newest ingredient or the newest food trend or health trend. So they look to peak performers. When they're at the gym, what is my peak performer friend telling me that I should be eating or I should not be eating? So if we were to put up the peak or the provider infographic, you would see, like I said, they're about 1/3 of the US population, but their share of voice is significantly less because they're not leading food system conversations. So it's not only thinking about why are we involved in the food system and in animal agriculture and the information we're sharing with a changing demographic around the US and around the world, but also who are we specifically engaging with. And so as we were preparing for this conference, one of the things that Emily just shared and that kept going through my mind is each and every one of us in this room have a role to play. Now, some of us may be great at Twitter. Some of us may be great at in-person conversations. I'm a former FFA officer. I can't say anything in 140 or 280 characters or less. So I'm much better at LinkedIn, where I can write full articles. And then you can choose whether you want to read it or not. Some of us live in an area where we can engage with more urban consumers more easily. Others of us maybe join an association and support our association or our cooperative or other entities so that we can do that. But no matter what our role is, I think each of us individually and as an organization, we need to have a communication strategy. Because again, just as we know in business, anytime we actually have a strategy mapped out, we're much more successful in achieving our goals or our objectives. So if we think about a communication strategy, what is it? Well, really it's a roadmap. It's that guiding document that helps us know what are the topics that we need to engage in, or if there's a topic that we as an individual or as an organization do not feel comfortable engaging in, who within our network can we refer people to, or where can we send people for information? It's that opportunity to collaborate, to figure out, are there different divisions within your organization that need to collaborate more fully? Are there allied industry partners? Just like Emily said, Genus obviously is a leading voice in genome editing, especially in the animal agriculture space, but they're collaborating with other organizations and entities. It's also a tool to measure success. My philosophy is if you can't measure, you can't evaluate it. So how do we know if we're being successful in our communication strategy if we don't ever have some goals written down that have some form of measurement? It's a resource document too. So as communication and engagement needs arise, we can go, who should we be reaching out to at XYZ organization or within our network? We also heard from the labor economists that people move around jobs. So if you have one communications director one day and a new communications director the next day, do you have a plan that you can hand them so they can figure out what is this organization's communication strategy and plan? How can they pick up that baton and keep running with it as opposed to having to start from ground zero? It's that resource to, again, aggregate activities, key performance indicators, resource allocation, etc. Again, it serves as that guiding document that we can go back to many, many times. And there's often places we can use a communications plan or a strategy that's written down. Obviously, our day-to-day regular communications. How are we engaging with different traditional or social media outlets, different influencers within our stakeholder network? Special events and activities. Are you rolling out a new product or a new technology or a new innovation? Do you have your communication strategy prepared? If you're in a governmental agency and you have a regulation or a rule change, do you have that communication strategy prepared so, again, when those questions come, you're ready? Major announcements. And, of course, then crises, which we do know in animal agriculture and the food system in general. Those happen from time to time. So are we prepared to engage? So, as the old adage says, it's basically we're going to plan our work, and then we actually work our plan. So then we're able to be much more effective. So, final activity before I wrap up. Write down on your piece of paper, sorry, it's not a Slido. I know some people had their phones ready. They were excited. We're going to do this the old-fashioned way. Write down in your notes, what is one strategy or tactic or idea or concept that you've heard during annual conference that you want to take back to your organization and apply to your communications about innovation and technology in animal agriculture? Just one thing that you're going to apply or visit with your team about to enhance your communications about animal agriculture, especially innovation and technology. Okay, now with that one item that you've written down, stand up. No, I'm serious, stand up. This wasn't figurative. Stand up. You're looking at me like, what? A speaker's never asked us to do something physical. Okay, now, look around. Yeah, shake it off if you've been sitting there a little bit. With that one item that you just wrote down, look around you and identify one person that you know well, that you visit with, collaborate with regularly. Go to them with that item that you just wrote down. Share your item with them. Have them share their item with you. And then find a time in 6 weeks or 8 weeks that you're going to email or call one another to say, how is that item coming? Have you actually done this? Hold each other accountable. So find that person, share that item, plan when you're going to check in with each other. When you're finished sharing, go ahead and find your seat. When you're finished sharing, go ahead and find your seat. Okay, even if you're not finished sharing, I'll go ahead and invite you to find your seat and you can continue scheming upon adjournment. So the good news is nobody used that opportunity to head for the door, so I'm going to count that as a facilitation win that you all still stuck with me. So as you're finding your seat, the final thing I would reiterate is we talk about in Media Training 101, the thing that I would underscore, the thing that I would draw your attention to is no matter your role in your organization or your operation, communication and engagement is all of our responsibility, whether it's formal through engagement with traditional or social media, whether it's visiting with community leaders that you serve on boards or committees with in your community, whatever the case might be. You're in this room because you are a food system leader. And so if we are going to earn and maintain trust in animal agriculture, no matter what our practices or our production models look like or our philosophies about animal agriculture, we have to engage, especially when it comes to technology and innovation. And then to underscore what Dr. Tarta said, words have a meaning. So as we think about sharing the stories of animal agriculture, we don't want to be like Eddie, who opened his business and couldn't figure out why business was bad, especially if we take a step back and look at what he was sharing with his stakeholders. So with that, I will say thank you for allowing me to share a few observations as we wrap up a great conversation about consumer engagement, especially when it comes to technology and innovation within the food system. If I can ever be of help or assistance, please look me up or let me know with one of those communication modes.